So I've seen a lot of videos where people discuss the difference between SQS and SNS. And while they do, of course, tell you the obvious differences, they don't always go in depth into how does it impact you? How does it change your experience as a developer? So that's what I wanted to do in this video and to cover when you should pick one over the other. So let's start with the biggest, most obvious difference between the two. SQS is a queue and SNS is for notification. You're like, duh, of course I know that. But this means that the way that you consume them is different. SQS, you have to pull things out of SQS, right? So let's say a message comes in. SQS is not going to do anything. It's just going to sit there until your application comes and says, hey, do you have something for me? Do you have something for me? Do you have something for me? Until there is something, and then you pull that out. With SNS, there's a topic and something comes into that topic, and any application that is subscribed to that topic will get that push immediately. And SNS will retry a couple of times, according to your retry policy, and then it's gonna give up. And then that can go into a dead letter queue or whatever. But SNS is not meant to act as a queue or a buffer to hold your stuff. Rather, things come in, they go out to the subscriber. I feel like that any video will tell you that, okay? But let's really examine the implications, the ramifications of this approach. But first, let me tell you how not to look at this. So you might think, well, if I have to be constantly polling SQS, hey, do you have anything? Do you have anything? That's kind of wasteful, and then there's something and then I get it. SNS will push things to you, so that might be better, right? Instead of you having to constantly go ask, you just wait for something to come your way and then you process that. And I've seen this way of looking at the difference between the two from front-end developers. So maybe you're building a messaging app, for instance, and you have to fetch messages or something in real time from the backend. So you can do it the sort of old-fashioned way where you poll the backend constantly. You're saying, hey, is there any updates? Hey, any updates? Hey, any updates? Or you can use WebSockets and the backend will just push updates to you, and it's not wasteful because you're not constantly having to go to the backend if there's nothing, right? But that's not at all the way that you should look at this. The right way to look at this is to say, when you're dealing with a queue such as SQS, because it's your service, it's your app that's gonna go to SQS, you have control over how much you get so that you know you're not gonna get hit so hard that you can't handle it. For instance, let's say that your server says, hey, I'm ready to handle 10 messages. Okay, you go to SQS and you're like, hey, give me 10 messages, please. Give me 50 messages, please. Instead, with SNS, you'll just get those 100 messages coming your way and you have to handle them. You either error out because your CPU or your memory goes up. So you can see it's not really meant for transactional work. And what do I mean by transactional? So imagine SQS, right? You get messages for, I don't know, a new file comes in S3 and then you get a message in SQS. This is a very common setup. All right, transactional is maybe, okay, I'm gonna download that file, I'm gonna do transformations, I'm gonna load it into my system, so an ETL. So that's transactional. Whereas SNS is for notifications of, hey, this thing happened, maybe you want to do something. To wrap up this idea, let me give you a real scenario from work. Of course, I don't want to violate non-disclosure, so I'll make it vague. One of my teams, they receive a lot of data from partners, terabytes of data. We get them through files, and then we, of course, have a queue waiting for these updates to come in. In the beginning, we're trying to decide what do we need. And imagine that we had gone with SNS, for instance. Well, if we're using SNS, which is what one of the developers proposed, if a partner came and sent us, hey, here is, 50,000 files in like 2 minutes, we get those notifications and we have to handle them, of course. So let's say that you just put them in memory and you're like, okay, I'll get to you later, and you store them in memory. Well, what happens if your server crashes? Well, you lose all of that and that's it, because it's not meant for that. You might say, well, okay, we're gonna get those notifications and then we're gonna store them in a database and then we're gonna get through them. But now you're just reinventing a queue. See, if you use SQS and a partner sends you 50,000 files with billions of records, let's say they are CSV files or something like that, they sit in that queue and the queue is gonna grow and you're gonna start draining. But your servers, they don't care. Your app that is going to SQS and saying, hey, give me 50 more, give me 100 more, it doesn't care how fast they're coming in because the queue is acting as a buffer. So you're not gonna see your CPU going through the roof, you're not gonna see your memory going through the roof. What's gonna happen is your queue is gonna start to have lag. And then you can set up scaling policies. You can say, well, if I'm draining the queue at 20 messages per second and the queue is growing at, I don't know, 40 messages per second. So let's scale up, let's spin up more servers. Furthermore, now SQS supports first in, first out and exactly once delivery. I don't want to go into exactly once, at least once, that maybe for another video, but this is not a guarantee that SNS can give you. So if you had to process exactly once, like maybe you have an order and you have to charge the credit card, you don't want to do that twice, 3 times, or you don't want to not do that at all. You want to do it exactly once. For that scenario, maybe something else is better, but let's say you're using SQS, well, then you have that exactly once delivery. Of course, then on your applications, you have to do a lot of things to support that. But really think of SNS more of notifications, like really the naming for the services is very correct. It's not meant to work as a queue where things just begin to pile up. This is more obvious by the fact that SNS supports, it can notify your servers, your APIs, yes, but it can also send that notification in the form of email, a push notification to an iOS or Android device. So really you can think of it as a way to notify either your backend or your users about something. Whereas SQS is more meant to for like if you want to do batch operations or if you really want to execute some sort of transactions in your database and you don't want to lose record. Now, before this video gets too long, let me give you one final difference between the two. Because SNS is meant for, publisher and subscriber, and many subscribers can be subscribed to one topic, it can do a fan out, right? So let's say you have a user created topic and a notification comes in and SNS notifies the fraud service, the user email notification service, and it sends a push notification to the user's phone. So you can sort of multiple services can listen on that same notification. But in SQS, because you have a queue and you pull messages, if the fraud service wants to come and pull messages, they will be owned by the fraud service. And if, the analytics service comes and tries to pull messages, it will not see the same messages that the fraud service saw. So one queue is really for one app. You can't have the fraud service and the analytics service listening on that same queue. And this is exactly when you combine SNS and SQS. So for instance, you have an user created topic and a message comes in, and you can have SNS deliver that message to the queue for the fraud service and the queue for the analytics service and whatever else you want to do. But now you can see that you can combine SNS, put it in front so that you can multiply that notification into multiple queues. And then the fraud service can run this long, expensive background check on the user. And the analytics service can, tailor promotions or whatever for the user. So they can run these transactional operations. There are more differences between them. I don't want to cover them. I just wanted to explain the biggest thing. How do you choose between them? That's all for now. Thank you.